So we're really excited to be joined today by Alex Barth on this episode. As a writer and digital producer at 98.5 The Sports Hub in Boston and a host of the Callin' It podcast, we're eager to hear Alex's perspective on the Bruins, who have made a lot of news over this past week or so. So Alex, thanks a lot for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Love it. So let's just start with the big elephant in the room, at least from our perspective, is Bruce Cassidy's firing. From the outside looking in, we thought this was a huge shock. So what happened here?
Yeah, it was a pretty big surprise here too. I think that I don't know that everybody was assured he was coming back next year, but I think the idea was that either they were going to run it back or there was going to be a complete overhaul, right? Either Cassidy was going to be back, or if he wasn't here, it's because Sweeney wasn't here and potentially Cam Neely wasn't here, and like they were just doing a whole overhaul, which I don't think would have been a bad path. This to me feels like a half measure. This to me feels like it's Don Sweeney trying to buy himself time, right? And say, well, no, it wasn't me. It wasn't the roster. It was the coach. He wasn't getting everything out of it I wanted to get out of it. And, you know, I don't believe that's the right assessment. We'll ultimately find out, right? We'll see who they bring in to replace him and all of that. It doesn't feel like they'll be able to upgrade just based on who's available on the market. But I think it was just kind of the team had struggled in the postseason for a number of years. Some people would characterize it as underperforming. Some people would say that, well, no, they gave you more or less what the roster was. You know, it's kind of glass half empty, glass half full kind of thing. But they were firing the coach to do something, right? They needed to do something. They don't want to move on from Patrice Bergeron if he's not ready to retire. You know, I don't think Cam Neely's ready to move on from Don Sweeney yet, his former teammate, his friend, but I don't think, you know, image-wise, they could just go into the next season, status quo, things are as they've been. So, you know, Bruce Cassidy becomes sort of just a logical fall guy. He becomes a guy who can put it all on and say, now we'll all fix it. And I mean, I know this is a hockey podcast. I don't know how much you guys follow the NBA, but last year, the Celtics did something similar. Granted, they also changed their GM, but they were a team that had talent. Maybe didn't have the most talent, but had talent. It felt like should be doing better than they were. They made a coaching change just to kind of get a new voice in the room. And ultimately, it worked out, right? They're in the NBA Finals, and Ime Udoka has been a home run. It almost feels like the Bruins are trying to copy that. But I think the key differences are they're different sports, right? The concentration talent is different in hockey than it is in basketball. And I don't think there's an Ime Udoka candidate out there right now in the world of hockey. Maybe way under the radar, I'm missing somebody. But somebody with his resume, with his experience, the people he had worked for, the championship pedigree, they got him to begin with. The Celtics did. Feels like a 1 in a million shot. And are the Bruins going to do the same thing, right? Or are they going to go 1 in a million? So I think that's kind of, the surface level view of it is they just think a new voice in the room is going to change things. We'll see whether or not that's enough. It doesn't feel like it right now, but I think the idea was that they needed to change something, and it was the easiest spot to make a change.
Yeah, those are all really good points. I think one area I want to direct my next question to is to what you talked about with Don Sweeney. I mean, let's face it, the Boston Bruins, I think personally, were expected to do better this year. I thought they were going to beat Carolina in 6. That didn't happen. Now there's a little bit of a debacle with Bruce Cassidy getting fired. Pasternak's not happy. A lot of guys are getting hurt. I want to talk about Don Sweeney here. We've seen a lot of backlash directed towards him and also the rest of the front office. Do you think they have some blame to take for how this whole thing has transpired? We hear a lot about, I mean, any Boston Bruins fan knows that Boston hasn't drafted very well recently with that those 3 draft picks, remember, in the first round.
2015, yeah.
Right. And especially with the people who followed that, they've lost some key free agents like Krug. Is any of this Don Sweeney to blame?
Yeah, I mean, when you're the general manager, roster construction's on you, right? That's basically the job description. So I certainly think there's blame there. And if firing Cassidy makes things go worse, that's only going to snowball on him. So I think you look at the drafting. I think you look at some of the trades he's made, giving up a first round pick for Rick Nash on a rental that didn't really net anything. Andre Kasha, was that 2 years ago? I think that was 19 or 20. It was 20 right before the pandemic. That obviously didn't net anything. He had concussion problems, which is unfortunate, but it's one thing if you can't make the picks. We see this across all sports where some teams, they just can't draft and they know it, and they get creative and they use those draft picks in other ways. Look at what the Los Angeles Rams just did, right? The problem is you have to hit on those trades. And I think, in Boston, we looked at it and said, are you really I know you're not making the picks, but are you maximizing those picks? And I even look at the Hampus Lindholm trade they made this year. That to me is a great trade. They got a young player at cost. I know they didn't trade for him on a long-term deal, but ultimately they turned it into a long-term thing, right? A guy they really needed, all of that. So did they give up that much more to get Hampus Lindholm than they did for, say, Andre Kasha? I know there's a couple other picks involved there, but it felt like they could have been swinging for the fences a little bit more, right? And maybe this is an indication that it's a new Don Sweeney, that he made this deal this year and he's kind of learned his mistakes, but it does feel like they've shortchanged themselves a couple times in roster construction. And then also I would say we'll call it a hesitancy to move on from veteran players. And look, it's never easy to move on from cornerstones, but they went through that whole Tuukka Rask experiment this year. That didn't work. That turned out to be a major distraction. Yeah. Even right now, and look, I love Patrice Bergeron. Everybody in Boston loves Patrice Bergeron. He absolutely should retire a Boston Bruin. But if you're going to move on from a promising coach and you're going to maybe delay a rebuild for a year where right now you don't have a contending roster anyway, like it just feels like you're grasping at straws at that point. So I think that's where, when it comes to Sweeney, the blame falls.
Yeah, absolutely. I've heard so much. It's like any Bruins fan that I come across on Twitter that I know have a lot to say about Don Sweeney in the front office, rightfully or unfairly or unfairly. But you hinted at Patrice Bergeron. That was the next question I had locked and loaded in my mind. So that's a perfect segue. How do you think all of this impacts his decision?
Well, I think this is, we won't know until we know who the replacement coach is, right?
Okay.
Because I think, he's not going to come back and play for a coach he doesn't want to play for. If it's a guy like Jay Leach, who's been in the system, and I was his teammate at one point. I don't remember if they were ever on the team together in 06. Bergeron was like in and out of the minors at that point. But like that, might be more amenable to a guy like Barry Trotz, who's a good coach, but he's never really played for it. He doesn't have a relationship with. That just might be weird. So, I don't think we have all the information left to answer that question, but I can't imagine it in the current situation he's any more encouraged to come back. Right. The direction's not there right now. And if I'm him, I go to them and say, you tell me why I should come back. Right. They kind of have to sell it to him at this point. He doesn't have anything left to prove. He could use another cup, but he really doesn't have anything left to prove. So it's a tough sell right now if you're the Bruins to convince him to come back for another year, because what are you selling him on? Brad Marchand's out for 2 months. You're missing your top defenseman and Charlie McAvoy for a while. You don't necessarily have the assets in place to cushion those losses or even to add on top of that. They've got a lot of money tied up. They don't have a lot of flexibility to be they don't have a lot of flexibility this offseason, especially if then Bergeron comes back. You had that on top of it. So I'm not like saying he's definitely going to retire, right? I think that he's a guy who loves competition. He loves the game. I think they're going to have to drag him off the ice, but he's, he dealt with some injuries last year and he's getting up there in age. And does he want to come out and, be on a team that's scraping for the final playoff spot? Is that how he wants to spend this part of his career? It's a tough sell.
Yeah, those are all very good points. And I think another tough sell here is the David Pastrnak situation. I really want to get your perspective on this. With Bruce Cassidy getting fired, it came out that, first of all, he wasn't happy with it. It also came out that he wasn't happy with how they let Krejci walk pretty easily. Also not on very good terms with Don Sweeney. Now there's trade talks coming out and his agent started talking about that. That might have been a little bbit overhyped. I think my question for you is, do you think that David Pastrnak resigns, or does he want to trade? What are your thoughts on that?
I like gut feeling, I think he resigns because he does like living in Boston and he does like being a Bruin, aside from some of the stuff going on around the organization right now. I think if Bergeron comes back, he loves playing with Patrice Bergeron and the opportunities they let him do that, obviously. The one thing that gives me pause is, I mean, it's been a thing in the NBA for a long time. You're seeing it now in the NFL, even a little bit in baseball, where these superstars are kind of realizing their value. And if you're not going to make them happy, if you're not going to give them everything they want, they'll leave, right? And that's not quite in hockey yet. I don't know if there's like a glaring example of that in hockey. Maybe John Tavares leaving the Islanders kind of fits that bill, but it's not, Anyway, it's going to get to hockey eventually. It's going to get to every sport eventually. That's just the reality of it. This kind of the stage is set for Pastrnak to make, a Tom Brady type of move, or a Bryce Harper type of move, or LeBron James type of move, or however you want to characterize it, right? The pieces are all in place. Will he do it? He doesn't seem like that guy. I don't know. It's coming. It's coming to the NHL eventually. I don't know if Pastrnak's that guy, but if his agent gets in his ear, somebody else gets in his ear, whatever, the pieces are set. And then it comes, I don't think the Bruins would let him walk. I think if ultimately he's not going to resign, they would trade him. They can't lose him for nothing. But I think ultimately they make him happy. I think they might have to make some concessions. But you got rid of your coach. Your captain is, whether or not he comes back this year, your captain is 1 foot out the door at this point. That's your franchise. David Pastrnak, that's your franchise. If you want, I would let him have a say in the coaching decision. I would let him have a say in what line he plays on, right? I think you got to do something to make him happy and bring him back. And I think the Bruins will ultimately do that, because I think they would realize just how much trouble they're in if he leaves.
Yeah, I think our gut feeling as well is that he's going to re-sign. But it is kind of crazy to hear some instability within the Bruins, franchise, because that's not something we ever expect, or kind of come to expect, right? We come to expect them to be super solid.
Right.
But you touched on, and this will be our last question in the interest of time. We don't want to take too much of your time. But speaking of basketball, I've heard a few people actually frame this upcoming season for the Bruins as kind of what happened with the Golden State Warriors a few years ago, right? All the guys, they got their surgeries, they retooled, drafted James Wiseman, and now they're fighting for titles again. Do you see the Bruins situation being similar to that, or is it something you think is going to turn into a full-fledged rebuild?
I don't think they'll ever do a full-fledged rebuild,
Okay.
like completely clean house. I think what you just said, and I apologize to keep crossing sports on you guys, but
That's all good.
Like what the Warriors did, where everybody's hurt. It's a transitional year anyway. What do you want to win 40 games for? What good does that do you, right? The worst place you can be in the NHL is middle of the pack.
Yeah.
This is the worst place you can be. So I would love to see that. And from my understanding, and I don't know, maybe you guys follow this closer than me. I'm not a huge NHL draft guy, but from my understanding, the 2023 class is stacked. It's loaded.
Yeah.
It's a good year, right? It's a good year. If you're going to pick a year to play for the draft, that's a year you'd want to do it.
Yeah.
Now that becomes a little tougher to do if Patrice Bergeron is back, right?
Yes.
How do you sell him? How do you sell the fan base on, I don't want to say wasting the last year of Patrice Bergeron, or potentially the last year of Patrice Bergeron, but you're not exactly capitalizing on it either. So it's tough. I don't know that there's a right answer there. I think at a certain point, you kind of have to take the emotion out of it. And, what's better for the 5-year outlook of the franchise? It's probably what you just described. And Marchand's not going to be available for a good chunk of the season. McAvoy's not going to be available for a good chunk of the season. Play some of the kids you've drafted, you haven't brought up, see what they can do. Either you get a pleasant surprise out of that, or you get a top 10 draft pick. It's a win-win. And then you go for it again 2023. Some money comes off the books. You add in free agency, add some kids. Who was I talking to the other day? I think it was was it the Florida Panthers? One of the teams that's late kind of had a similar process where, it was the New York Rangers. Sorry, the New York Rangers,
Yeah.
right? Kind of had a similar process where they got some high draft picks and then they let some money come off the books. And, they had to move on from Hendrik Lundqvist in all of that, which is not easy to do. To a guy from your franchise like that. And Bergeron is of that standing, if not more so, in Boston than what Hank was in New York. So, on paper, if you want to take the cold hard approach to it, you tell Bergeron, thanks for 20 years. We'll see when we retire your number, but we're going to go in this direction right now. But it's not as simple as just doing that, right? So I think that's what it comes down to. It's a tough decision to make. And that, I think that's ultimately right now, Don Sweeney's on the ropes. He's still here, but it feels like the pressure is building. I think answering that question, that's the big question right now. Which direction do you go? And I think answering that question correctly decides Don Sweeney's future in Boston.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if he can sort of guide this ship and this retool, he definitely will buy himself some time and some credibility. So it'll be interesting to see how these next few months play out. But Alex, again, in the interest of time, we don't want to take too much of your time. So just want to thank you again.
I got another like 5 minutes if you guys got another one.
You know what? One question we want to ask you is regarding Brad Marchand. I mean, this is something that I have a little bit of stake in the game here because Brad Marchand is on my fantasy team. So this is kind of a one-on-one question I want to ask you. Do you think Brad Marchand with bilateral hip repairs comes back at 100%? Or do you think the 100-point Brad Marchand Selke candidate Brad Marchand is kind of gone in the past after these injuries?
So I'm not a doctor, so I'm just going to regurgitate things I've read medical professionals say about this. I think he can come back, but it's like a year-long thing. So even after you recover from the surgery, there's like a year of feeling out process, like a torn ACL. So I think he can get to that player again. I don't think it's guaranteed he will, because you start adding up the years here, the recovery time and that, and suddenly he's in his mid-30s. Yeah. He also, by the time he gets back to full speed, is he playing on the same line as Patrice Bergeron? That certainly helps elevate those numbers. So I don't think he's cooked by any means. I still think he can be an impactful player. I still think he can be an all-star caliber player, but it's not going to, there's a path to get there. It's not necessarily going to be easy to do. He's not just going to come back from the injury and just do it day one. But I do think he can get back there.
I mean, I'm excited to see it. I mean, from an objective hockey fan, not a Leafs fan. As a Leafs fan, I don't really want to see Boston do well because you guys have hurt us for so many years. But as an objective hockey fan,
who hasn't? To be fair, who hasn't hurt you for so many years?
Oh my God, Columbus, Montreal, the list goes on and on. Tampa this year, but yeah, as an objective hockey fan, when the Bruins do well, the NHL does well. So hopefully they come back strong next year and are able to get back right where they left off this year.
Yeah, that 1 year timeline kind of works out with that little plan that we had talked about. So if it's all Galaxy brain, this works out, then Don Sweeney and Cam Miller, you're gonna look brilliant.
Yeah, they will, absolutely. And yeah, no, it's always good when the original 6 teams do well. That's all. Sure. I like blue bloods, right? Like I like when blue blood teams are in all sports. Like I'm a big fan of that. I have no time for the Florida Panthers. I have no time for the Tampa Bay Lightning. Like Colorado's cool. I'm all in Colorado. That's a fun team. Okay. Like seeing Edmonton get this far was cool, but like Columbus, what is it? There's no history there, right? I like it. I'll favor other blue bloods to Toronto, certainly. Okay. But I always like when the blue bloods do well. So that's fun. I can admit that.
Can't blame you there. And just before we wrap up, quick fire, 10 seconds. Who's winning the Stanley Cup?
I think Colorado. I think that they got those team of destiny feels. I know Tampa's loaded and they're Tampa, but to get to this stage, this many years, that's got to take some wear and tear. I think Colorado's the next big team. I think I'm speaking more with my heart than my head, but I like Colorado.
Yeah, I got Colorado too. Angelo here has Tampa, so we're all kind of split. It'll be interesting to see how it all plays out.
Yeah, but Alex, once again, thanks so much for doing this. Before we wrap up, we just want to give our listeners a chance to hear you tell them where they can find your work so they can check out your stuff a little bit more.
Yep, 985thesportshub.com. We have a ton of stuff. Myself, Matt Dolph, and Ty Anderson, who I work with, who are big-time hockey guys. They have every single angle of the kind of the Bruins situation covered. So if you want more, again, it's super in-depth. They've got, what went wrong behind the scenes. Today, Matt did a breakdown on where Bruce Cassidy is most likely to end up. All of that, 985thesportshub.com. And you can follow me on Twitter at RealAlexBarth.
Awesome. Alex, thanks again for taking the time out of your day to join us. We really appreciate it. And everyone, be sure to check out Alex's work and this podcast as well that we've listened to. It's a great listen. So check him out. And Alex, thanks so much again.
Thanks for having me, guys.